You are less, you are weaker, you are smaller, you do not belong. These words are familiar, aren't they? This is a secret war you have been carrying inside your skin, the war that whispers you're already behind before the day has even started. You walk into a room and instantly feel smaller, as if everyone else is brighter, stronger, more worthy of being there than you. You try to speak, but the words stick in your throat. You laugh, but it feels hollow. You pretend you're fine. But inside, there's a voice that gnaws at you. You are not enough. You will never be enough. And when you are alone, when there is no mask to wear, that voice grows louder. It tells you you've already failed. It tells you to settle. It tells you to keep shrinking, keep apologizing, keep disappearing. That war has a name. It is called the inferiority complex, a type of pathological self-belittlement. Every person who feels small carries a history that shaped that feeling, and that history begins in the earliest relationships, life events, and inner responses that form a lasting sense of self. Childhood experiences create powerful impressions, and those impressions shape how a person reads the world, talks to themselves, and meets other people. The mind stores certain events as proof about personal value, and when those early events say, "not enough," the mind treats that message as fact. Alfred Adler described the origin of smallness as a reaction to felt inferiority that begins in the first years of life. A child who cannot run as fast, who struggles to learn to read, or who loses attention in the family will feel a gap between ability and desire, and that gap produces a sense of weakness or lack. Parents and caregivers shape the meaning of those gaps by the way they respond. Encouragement and clear guidance tend to help the child learn and grow, while constant criticism, comparison with siblings, or excessive protection teach the child that the world is dangerous and that personal power is unreliable. Adler called the efforts to make up for felt weakness compensation, and he warned that compensation becomes pathological when it fixes a person into either continual withdrawal or exaggerated striving that hides true need. When striving fails to produce real growth, the mind turns compensation into a fixed belief that the self is fundamentally lacking, and that belief becomes the inferiority complex that narrows life and choice. Carl Jung added depth to this view by showing how the unconscious holds parts of the personality that the conscious mind rejects, and those rejected parts create a hidden pressure that shapes behavior from below awareness. When a child learns that anger, clumsiness, or neediness brings punishment or shame, those traits slip into the shadow, exerts force through sudden reactions, attraction to forbidden choices, and through the formation of complexes, which are tightly charged emotional patterns bound to images of weakness or danger. A person who carries a strong inferiority complex will often deny those feelings in public by wearing a social mask, the persona, which shows the face that the world approves, while the shadow gathers the parts that feel small, ashamed, or unfit. The split between persona and shadow creates inner tension, and the greater the split, the more the unconscious will push the person into self-sabotage or into exaggerated roles that hide true need. Both Adler and Jung emphasized that early social context gives meaning to simple events, and that meaning becomes a lens through which all later experiences pass. A single episode of being laughed at by classmates becomes evidence of incompetence if caregivers echo that view or fail to correct it, and that evidence then colors later attempts at risk, learning, and intimacy. The mind simplifies complex experience into short rules, such as people will reject me or effort is useless, and those rules narrow behavior. Those rules also attract confirmation. A person who expects rejection will avoid close contact, and that avoidance will produce loneliness, which then confirms the original idea. This cycle turns a first small wound into a long pattern of diminished ambition, low self-claim, and a habit of giving ground in relationships and work. Alfred Adler explained that the inferiority complex arises when a person perceives gaps between what they want to achieve and what they feel capable of achieving, and when that perception becomes fixed, it directs behavior in ways that reinforce the feeling of inadequacy. Rather than serving as a temporary signal to improve, the feeling becomes a persistent lens that colors every interaction, every judgment, and every effort. The mind begins to anticipate failure, to discount personal contribution, and to interpret neutral or ambiguous feedback as proof of insufficiency. The machinery of the inferiority complex is highly adaptive in its own way. Early in life, it helps a child survive by avoiding experiences that previously caused humiliation or pain. The child learns to anticipate rejection, to stay small in social contexts, and to minimize exposure. However, over time, this adaptation becomes a limitation. Withdrawal from challenges, fear of judgment, and excessive self-criticism protect the individual from immediate discomfort, but prevent growth, learning, and authentic engagement with the world. This creates a paradox. What initially protects now confines. The individual invests energy in strategies that give short-term relief, but maintain long-term smallness, and the effort spent hiding, avoiding, or overcompensating reduces the ability to act freely. Compensation is a central part of the machinery. Adler observed that people naturally attempt to balance perceived weakness by developing other strengths. A child who struggles academically may excel in sports or social charm. A person who feels physically small may cultivate intellectual skill or work ethic. Compensation becomes problematic when it becomes the primary identity, when achievement replaces authentic self-expression, or when striving turns into an obsession that continually seeks validation. Rather than resolving the inferiority complex, overcompensation can reinforce it by making self-worth contingent on external outcomes, keeping the mind in a constant cycle of striving and self-judgment. Projection also plays a role in maintaining the complex. Jung explained that disowned parts of the self often appear in perceptions of others. A person who judges themselves as weak, lazy, or unworthy will notice those traits in others and react with strong emotion, often anger or fear. By seeing these traits outside, the mind avoids confronting the same traits inside. This mechanism explains why people with deep inferiority feelings may be highly critical of others or unusually sensitive to criticism. The mind interprets external judgments as evidence that its hidden fears are real, creating a self-reinforcing cycle in which the environment seems to confirm the internal belief of smallness. The machinery also manipulates attention and perception. The mind of a person with an inferiority complex scans for evidence of failure, rejection, or inadequacy. Positive feedback is discounted, reinterpreted, or ignored, while negative events loom large and dominate memory. The nervous system becomes attuned to threat rather than opportunity, and ordinary setbacks feel catastrophic because they align with the internal narrative of insufficiency. This attentional bias reinforces the sense of being small and unworthy and prevents the individual from noticing patterns of competence, success, or contribution that contradict the internal rule of inadequacy. Social comparison acts as fuel for the complex. From an early age, people compare themselves to siblings, peers, and role models. When comparison favors others, the mind internalizes that difference as proof of inferiority. These comparisons are rarely neutral. Social structures, cultural norms, and media amplify standards that are often unrealistic or arbitrary. The inferiority complex feeds on this environment, making the individual more sensitive to differences in achievement, appearance, or social recognition. Even small perceived gaps between self and others can be interpreted as permanent deficiencies rather than temporary differences. And this interpretation strengthens the machinery that keeps self-belittlement active. Projection is another critical element of this process. Jung described projection as the unconscious act of attributing unwanted traits, feelings, or impulses to others. A person who judges themselves as weak, incompetent, or unworthy will notice those qualities in others, often exaggerating their presence. This projection allows the individual to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths about themselves, but it also distorts perception of the world and reinforces the internal belief of smallness. Interpersonal conflict, envy, and fear of judgment often emerge from these projections, and the person remains trapped in patterns of self-comparison, critique, and self-limiting behavior. One peer-reviewed study done in President University of Indonesia focused on the behavioral patterns associated with inferiority complex in adolescence. Researchers observed a group of high school students over the course of 2 academic years, assessing self-reported feelings of inadequacy, social comparison tendencies, and patterns of academic and social engagement. The study found that students who consistently reported high levels of inferiority were more likely to withdraw from challenging academic tasks, avoid leadership opportunities, and limit participation in social activities. These behaviors reflected the compensatory strategies Adler described, in which avoidance and withdrawal served to protect the individual from perceived failure. The study also revealed a strong correlation between self-reported inferiority and heightened sensitivity to peer evaluation, confirming Adler's assertion that early experiences and social context shape a persistent internal sense of smallness. Students who received positive reinforcement and opportunities to experience success gradually reduced avoidance behaviors, indicating that intervention and supportive environments can counteract the effects of deeply ingrained feelings of inferiority. The process of shrinking shows itself in everyday life through simple habits that carry deep meaning. A person who asks for less than is deserved in a job interview or who silences a needed opinion in a meeting acts from a long pattern of low claim. A parent who allows children to take the lead in social settings may have learned to make room for others, because attention once felt dangerous or unearned. A student who overprepares and still worries about failure may attempt to patch a fragile self with performance, and performance itself can become a mask that hides the core fear of not being enough. These behaviors keep the self small because they trade real presence and open risk for defensive tactics that secure short-term acceptance. Patterns that begin in small events grow into stories that organize life, and those stories contain the rules that keep a person from full action. Adler described the private life plan that individuals form, and Jung described the complexes that pull attention away from the center of the self. Both ideas describe a single dynamic. Early pain creates a hidden map of what to avoid and what to seek, and that map channels energy into either safe repetition or anxious striving. The map may feel like cautious wisdom, but when it limits growth and deprives life of meaningful risk, it becomes a prison. The first step away from that prison is understanding how the map formed, because knowledge of origin weakens the power of unconscious rules and opens a possibility of choosing new directions. If this spoke to you, share it, because every human being deserves to know their difference is their power.